If you're like me, you've been following the development of the Callisto Protocol like a hawk. Created by Striking Distance Studios and with horror gaming legend Glenn Schofield at the helm, I think most of us are expecting a sci-fi horror experience that is truly transcendent and arguably even more anxiety-inducing than Callisto's predecessor, the legendary Dead Space. While they may be similar in scope and plot, the Callisto Protocol is taking the genre of sci-fi horror to the next level. I mean, if you've watched any of the numerous trailers that have been released so far, I think you already know what I'm talking about. Before we really get into the meat of it, let's take a look at a very brief history of sci-fi horror as a whole and find out why it's such an enduring and extremely versatile genre within popular culture. Chapter 1. An endless sense of dread. Ever walked somewhere alone at night and gotten the feeling you're being watched? Or how about lying in your bed in the dark and imagining what might be lurking in the shadows? Now, the idea of the weird or the alien is something that horror deals with extensively, and naturally, the realm of science fiction does exactly the same, albeit with distant planets, strange interplanetary civilizations, and supermassive black holes. But really, while space is something that inspires many people and has scientists practically falling over each other every time they discover a new star system, the idea of the infinite is kind of terrifying. And who better to consult on the matter than the immensely talented and deeply flawed Howard Phillips Lovecraft, more affectionately known as HP. No, not the guys who make printers that don't work. Anyway, Lovecraft was undoubtedly filled with prejudice and fear. Don't Google the name of his cat. But he's pretty much regarded as the father of cosmic horror. And what do I mean by that? Yep, it's the magnificently morbid marriage between science fiction and horror. You might think that's a little reductive, and it kind of is. But at the core of stories like The Call of Cthulhu and The Shadow over Innsmouth are the ideas of great eternal beings that have been around since the beginning of time and are terrible beyond comprehension. In Lovecraft's universe, humanity is insignificant and has no real concept of the true horrors of the universe or what lies at its fringes. But while Lovecraft's stories may concern interdimensional beings and slathering idiot gods, I'm not kidding about that, they all deal with humanity's relationship with these things, however odd, esoteric, or subconscious it may be. Let's be real, the fear of the unknown, or perhaps more accurately, the unknowable, is really what has munched away at humanity's gooey center since we first became conscious of our own being. Simply put, existence is an extremely weird experience, but here we are, experiencing it. Chapter 2. Time, Distance, and Corruption. The Callisto Protocol and Dead Space are built on top of these foundations, and, naturally, they've extended these notions and narratives into full-length games featuring embattled protagonists and utterly insane creatures just waiting to cut you to pieces. Now, it's virtually impossible to talk about the Callisto Protocol without discussing what you could call its source material, Dead Space. To be more precise, I think we can draw some conclusions about the Callisto Protocol by comparing it with and evaluating it alongside Dead Space. So to begin, what are some common themes between these two different universes? Let's take a look. Number 1. Both games take place on or around far-off worlds. In the original Dead Space, Isaac travels to the Aegis system to find out what happened to the planet cracker USG Ishimura, which is in orbit around a planet called Aegis 7. In the Callisto Protocol, everything takes place in and around Black Iron Prison, a penal colony located on Callisto, the second largest moon of Jupiter. In both plots, the player gets a sense of places that are incredibly far away and filled with mystery and intrigue. Naturally, Callisto isn't quite as abstract as Aegis 7 since it's an actual moon and just close enough to Earth to increase the player's sense of dread. Proximity is a big part of horror, and in a way, if something is too far away, it seems a little less frightening. However, if it's on your interplanetary back porch, you may just feel a little uneasier. Number 2. Both games feature troubled protagonists. It's not entirely evident that Isaac is troubled when Dead Space begins, but as the game progresses, we get more insight into Isaac's psychology, which is clearly adversely affected by the red marker. In the Callisto Protocol, Jacob Lee is an inmate at Black Iron Prison. According to the Callisto Protocol wiki, Jacob crash lands a ship carrying a mysterious cargo on Callisto. Beyond that, it's not entirely obvious why Jacob is incarcerated at Black Iron, but from what it appears, he seems more like a tragic victim of fate than a hardened criminal or lunatic. From what I can tell from the source material, Jacob is a complex character who has suffered in the past, and in a way, I think this makes him a little more relatable to people. I'm not saying he's more or less likable than Isaac, but I am saying that I feel particularly inclined to find out more about him as a protagonist, which is a good thing. The more you care about a protagonist and their well-being, the more impactful it is when things don't go well for them, or even when they do. Number 3. The enemies in both games are human. I'm not even sure I need quotes here. In Dead Space, Isaac faces off against necromorphs, hideously deformed creatures with blade-like appendages that are actually mutated former crew members of the Ishimura and later on the USM Valor and the dig site. There are also a few human enemies like Dr. Mercer who prove particularly troublesome. Can anyone say Regenerator? Similarly, in the Callisto Protocol, Jacob Lee faces off against the Biophage, mutated former inmates, and I guess staff at Black Iron Prison. I also assume that there's some kind of warden or main human enemy in the Callisto Protocol, judging by the main voiceover from one of the trailers. Anyway, in both games, players need to aim for the appendages of their enemies to bring them down more efficiently. But the Callisto Protocol seems to allow for the ability to stealth kill enemies in certain instances, while ranged combat seems deliberately more troublesome. But more on that a bit later. Number 4. Both games feature some really gruesome death sequences. Now, what sci-fi horror game would be complete without some extremely graphic and brutal character deaths? In many cases, if you get killed by an enemy, your character is torn to shreds, pulverized into mincemeat, or just straight up eviscerated. All of this comes from Dead Space, and the Callisto Protocol builds on this by offering some particularly heinous environmental deaths and enemies. Obviously, the Callisto Protocol has superior graphics over the original Dead Space, though the upcoming remake may more or less match it, but the animations themselves are truly gory and more than enough to make some players lose their lunch. If you're squeamish, definitely keep that bath bag handy, won't you? Number 5. Both games create a sense of entrapment. The original Dead Space takes place aboard a massive spaceship that's gone dark and orbiting some far-off alien world, and the Callisto Protocol takes place in a literal prison on an isolated moon. While the levels may have been pretty linear in Dead Space, I love the claustrophobic feel of the passageways and the almost boxy feeling of the Ishimura. The Callisto Protocol looks like it offers much the same experience in that respect. And yeah, there are obviously sections where Isaac is out in space and where Jacob wanders the surface of Callisto, but I would hardly call that free. If you're going to survive in either of these games, you're going to have to earn it. So if you know Dead Space and have checked out what's on offer for the Callisto Protocol so far, I'm sure you can think of a couple of other overlaps, but I think those are some of the biggest ones. But now onto the deeper analysis. What sets the Callisto Protocol apart from Dead Space? Chapter 3. Upping the Ante. Okay, don't crucify me for saying this, but there are some aspects of Dead Space I didn't particularly enjoy. Yeah, I honestly feel like I'm blaspheming saying that, but while Dead Space is an amazing game, it ain't perfect. First and foremost, and I'm sure many people will agree, I wasn't a big fan of the whole Nicole thing and the romantic interest. Maybe it's just because I played the original Dead Space a billion times, but shoehorning romance into a sci-fi horror game just doesn't really do it for me. I realize it's a plot device and gives Isaac some measure of emotional depth, but I don't really think it was the best choice. Now, I'm honestly not sure if there's any kind of romance in the Callisto Protocol, but if there is, I hope it doesn't form a major part of the plot. You're free to disagree here, but my assumption is that Jacob Lee will be more concerned with simply surviving than finding his missing girlfriend. I think in games like Silent Hill, which have emotional and even oddly romantic elements, this kind of plot element makes sense. However, in sci-fi horror games, especially one as brutal as the Callisto Protocol, I don't really see the point. From the gameplay that's been revealed in the trailers, combat seems particularly intense and kinetic. When Jacob swings that baton and it hits an enemy, you really feel the force of the impact as the camera briefly zooms in and back out again. Similarly, when firing his pistol, there's a pretty decent amount of recoil. There's pretty much none of that with Isaac's plasma cutter or the pulse rifle. The increased movement therefore makes combat more disorienting and even a bit dizzying, which is actually a lot more what it would be like in real life. The mechanics here make combat way more intimate and hard-hitting. So I feel like once you've gone through an area with a ton of enemies, you may actually be physically exhausted from the effort. It's also nice to see a little variation in the way combat works in the Callisto Protocol. You can sneak up behind certain enemies and knife them in the back in order to conserve ammo. And you can even use admittedly conveniently placed grinders and open turbines, I guess Black Iron isn't up to code with safety, to eviscerate your enemies in an instant. To make this easier, Jacob has something akin to Isaac's kinesis module called Grip, but it's actually more like Half-Life 2's gravity gun. I have a feeling that players and speedrunners will be using this mechanic as much as possible to rapidly clear areas, just like they used Isaac's stasis module in the original Dead Space and its sequels. And in the spirit of Dead Space 2 and the microtransaction-riddled Dead Space 3, there are sequences where you'll have to do your very best to ensure that Jacob Lee doesn't drown, get crushed, or meet his untimely end in any number of terrible ways. I personally don't have a problem with the odd quick-time event, but judging by the gameplay where Jacob has to survive a long and treacherous slide down a water pipe, players will need to use skill and quick thinking to avoid objects and ensure Jacob makes it through. Finally, lead dev Glenn Schofield just recently revealed that the Callisto Protocol contains several beta paths that will have an effect on the game's overall plot and even extend the game in certain respects. He made sure not to reveal too much about these beta paths so that players themselves can find them and enjoy the thrill of discovery. I think this is a great mechanic that fundamentally increases the game's replayability, and if anything, I think that everyone will really enjoy finding these paths once the Callisto Protocol drops on December 2nd, 2022. Chapter 4. A new kind of horror. I for one cannot wait for the Callisto Protocol to drop, and just over a month later, the Dead Space remake will hit stores. It looks like Christmas is coming twice for fans of the sci-fi horror genre, and to say I'm excited about both games is an understatement. I really have very high hopes for the Callisto Protocol, and judging by Glenn Schofield's impeccable track record and attention to detail, I have little doubt that this is going to be a huge leap forward for the genre. So, what do you think of this analysis of the Callisto Protocol? Are there any details I missed? Would you like to see more analyses of horror games like this? Let us know in the comments, and be sure to like and subscribe so you get all that good content delivered to you as and when it drops. Later!